Chapter 1. "That better be black, no sugar, or I'll be returning you to the pound," Rob called after his new partner from the squad car just before he disappeared into the bright lights of the gas station convenience store. Damn rookies. Rob looked around the darkened parking lot. Tranny on the corner turning tricks, bum at the side of the building sleeping on the sidewalk. It was a quiet night. Other than the normal nightlife of the streets, there hadn't been too much going on so far. Nothing worth the time it would take to process. Yeah, Rob could set up and observe the tranny, but that'd just waste an hour watching him, another hour processing, just to have him back on the street within 4 hours. What would be the point other than wasting his time? Damn, getting old. Hell, there was a time Rob would have been all over the idea of dragging the tranny in. He'd have sat there, recorded the plate numbers of all the Johns, dragged her to the station, and then busted them all. Not that it ever did any good. The system wasn't terrible, but it sure did have its flaws. In the end, what did it really matter? The tranny never hurt anyone. Rob turned his attention to the convenience store. Rook was at the counter paying for both of their coffees. A young pup, new to the force. This was his first night out on patrol, and Rob was stuck babysitting him. By itself, it wasn't too bad, since his partner for 10 years had taken early retirement last month, leaving Rob to sit at a desk and waiting to get back on the street. This Rook was his ticket off the desk, but as with any hotshot, he was on his way to the morgue. Rooks. They were always craving action, itching for it. They were always looking for the big case, the next action scene, as though everything on television was real. They wanted to be heroes, and every minute they were doing paperwork was another minute keeping them from it. Early retirement. Maybe Rob was getting too old, but after what had happened, he dreaded even thinking about doing that to his wife and kids. The car shook as the Rook pulled too hard on the door, fumbling not to dump the coffee all over him and the car seat. "You said cream with 2 sugars, right?" Rob looked harshly at the nervous kid, glaring his answer until the kid broke into a large smile. "Just kidding with you. Black, no sugar, just like you asked." Rob took the cup, his hands numb to the heat, numb from too many hot cups of coffee on the streets. He took a long sip, relishing the scent, before setting the cup into the holder. "Not bad, Rook," Rob said as he reached forward to put the car into gear. "Tommy." "What?" "My name, it's Tommy." "We'll see, Rook." Hot shots. They burn hot, but they go out fast. Rob eased out of the parking lot, glaring at the tranny. "Should we bust her? I mean, him, it?" "You'll learn." "Learn what?" "Car 112, come in, please. Car 112, come in." The radios crackled on their shoulders. The rookie reached for his to respond. "Yeah, Car 112 here, dispatch, go ahead." "Backup is needed at 3880 North Milwaukee Avenue. They're requesting 3 units. Are you able to assist?" "Roger that, on our way." The rookie looked over at Rob, his smile so big that his pearly whites showed in the passing streetlights. "Calm down, Rook. Just because we're going in as backup doesn't mean you'll get to see action." "Isn't that what backup means? They're getting ready to do a bust and want backup units to follow them in. That's us, right?" "We'll see." Hot shots. Rob drove his squad car inconspicuously past the address he was given and then radioed in his location. Detective Thomas was waiting for them and filled them in on the situation. It was a bust. A snitch had informed about a meth lab in a small inn halfway down the street. It was on the 3rd floor, in the mix with the other vagrants and deadbeats who pissed in the hallway. It was a seedy little place that rented more by the month than by the day, off the beaten path and away from incoming tourists, a perfect home for drug labs and prostitution dens. Rob could smell the urine the moment he entered the lobby. Detective Thomas already had the clerk subdued behind the glass barrier, keeping him quiet as the men worked their way through the lobby. Rook covered his nose quickly with an ugly look on his face from the stench. "Damn, what's that smell?" Rob looked at him coldly, shutting him up. Detective Thomas pulled his muscular frame up from the front desk clerk, leaving him with his hands zip-tied behind him. He pointed to Rook. "Keep an eye on him, and don't let the clerk let anyone know we're on our way up." Thomas looked at Rob and two other officers that lingered by the front door and then nodded toward the stairwell. Thomas then pointed to one of the other police officers in the lobby and motioned to the elevators. "Watch over these. Anyone comes down, you keep them here." Thomas turned to the stairwell and Rob followed him as they worked their way up the trash-covered stairs. The stench of urine grew, mixed with the rank odor of stale beer. Rob nudged an empty 40-ounce bottle out of his way, but froze when the bottle continued to roll. It bounced down a couple of steps before it shattered. Rob looked up to see the detective give him a disapproving look before continuing up the stairs. They reached the third floor, and Thomas cautiously opened the door, scanning the hallway to ensure there was no one there. Rob could smell the stench from the lab all the way out to the stairwell. It was overwhelming. The odor of rotten eggs mixed with cat urine. Rob wanted to gag as it burned his nostrils and his eyes watered. He let his fingers trace over the service pistol in his holster. He stroked the butt of it and then flicked his wrist to snap the strap. His heart felt like it was going to explode right out of his chest. Early retirement sounded better and better. Ever since his partner had left, it had been weighing heavily on his mind. Situations like this only made it worse, and made it hard for him not to think about his wife and son. Even a month before that, he hadn't thought too much about it, but now, since his partner left him saddled with a desk job unless he took on someone new, it wasn't his partner's fault. Still, it was easier to blame him than to think about what happened. No wife should ever have to watch her husband go through that. God, please let his wife never have to go through it. Let his wife never know the pain that he saw in that woman's eyes as he sat with her in the waiting room. Ed survived, but he would never be the man he was before. How could anyone? "Get ready," Detective Thomas said quietly. He signaled Rob to stay at the top of the stairwell and then motioned the remaining two officers to follow him. They quickly eased their way through the doorway and quietly walked until they stopped midway down the hall to set up on either side of the door. Thomas looked back and forth between the two officers, and then he leaned into the door, placing his ear against it. "You crazy bitch! What the hell do you think you're doing? You nearly bit my dick off!" a man yelled from one of the rooms along the hall, closest to Rob. Everyone turned to look. Rob held his breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Slowly, he turned and looked back at Thomas, who then returned his attention to the door. Thomas took a quick breath and then glanced over at Rob. In the next instant, the right half of Thomas's face disappeared in a bloody mess on the floor. The explosion of a shotgun echoed through the hall. It rang in Rob's ears but didn't register as much as the sight of what was left of Thomas's face. Half of it just gone, only lumps of flesh and bone mixing together as they fell to the floor. Gunshots exploded into the hallway, covering the sound of Thomas's limp body slowly falling to the floor on top of the remains of his face. Rob scanned the hallway, looking to see where the shots had come from. There was a door open at the far end of the corridor. It was open just a couple of inches with only darkness beyond. In those few inches, Rob could barely make out what looked to be the muzzle of a revolver, aiming to fire again. Rob raised his gun and aimed just a hair above the muzzle, figuring that whoever was behind that gun, his head wouldn't be too much higher. He had the space between the door and the doorframe in his sights, and he slowly began to squeeze the trigger. He didn't get a shot off before a flash came from the doorway. One of the two officers fell. Rob looked up quickly in shock. The officer had been nearly directly in his line of sight to the door. As far as Rob knew, he could be next. He brought his revolver up again and took a long, deep breath. He held it, steadying himself as he slowly pulled the trigger. In his entire career, for as many times he had pulled his revolver, he had never once fired it off the range. He watched as the hammer came slowly back. He never heard the footsteps running up the stairs behind him. "Police! Put down the gun and step out into the hallway!" Rob yelled, still trying to get up the nerve to finish squeezing the trigger. A heavy force slammed into Rob, sending his pistol flying, and Rob reaching to recover his balance before sprawling on the floor. In his younger, thinner days, he would have shifted his weight and rolled to the right. However, his body wasn't as limber as it once was, and instead he pulled his weight back, using his hands to reach out so that instead of sprawling forward, he was able to stand into a run. He quickly dashed to the wall, taking himself out of the line of fire of the shooter. He worked his way back to the corner, still keeping out of sight of whomever had slammed into him. His breath was burning in his lungs. He didn't realize that he'd been holding it, and slowly, quietly, he let it out. No sound came from the stairwell. He listened, but couldn't hear anyone else in or around the hallway. The couple that had been screaming before had gone quiet. Rob looked over at the two officers lying on the linoleum. The third was on the floor, writhing in pain. He must have been shot as Rob fell, since he hadn't seen it happen. However, at least he was still alive. Rob saw his gun. It had fallen to the center of the hallway. If he went for it, he would be in the open, easy to take out by either gunman, the one from the room at the end of the hall or the assailant waiting in the stairwell. He was trapped. The officer on the floor coughed suddenly, drawing Rob's attention. Smoke had started coming from under the door of the supposed meth lab. There was a crash from inside the room and the sound of glass shattering on the floor. Someone was cleaning up the evidence, but from the smoke, Rob knew they'd started a fire. The smoke was spilling out into the hallway, making the little available light from the street just a grayish fog. "Shit," someone said from the stairwell. If Rob had to guess, he would say he was African American. He had a heavy street accent and his voice was a deep bass. Rob doubted it was someone he would want to go up against. He wasn't a small man and he was healthy enough, going to the gym 3 times a week, but the man around the corner didn't sound like someone Rob wanted to tangle with. He'd already nearly taken him out once. He didn't want to give him another chance. He heard a heavy thump in the stairwell. It sounded like the man had taken a step down the stairs. Rob waited, and sure enough he heard another footstep, shortly followed by another. The man had walked back down the stairs. Rob figured he probably didn't want to have to deal with the fire coming from the room, or the firemen and law enforcement officers that would soon be there in much greater numbers. Rob turned to look back at the other end of the hallway. He could barely see it through the smoke, but he still worked his way along the wall, trying to be silent as he came to the door. He took a quiet, deep breath, fighting to breathe despite the smoke. He closed his eyes and did a mental 1, 2, 3 count. Then he turned and put his shoulder into the door with as much force as he could muster, hoping to knock out anyone hidden on the other side. The door slammed open with no resistance, smashing into the wall. The room was empty and the window was open. He could hear footsteps as they rushed down the metal fire escape. Rob briefly thanked the Lord as he turned back around. He could see from there that the stairwell was clear as well. "Dispatch, we have 3 officers down, 2 probable DOAs. Send 1 ambulance and a fire team," Rob said into his radio. The smoke rushed past him, filling the open room. Something smashed against the other side of the door to the meth lab. It was followed quickly by pounding. Inside, people were slamming their fists against the door, trying to escape. He could see the fire begin to lick out from under the door and guessed that the locks were too hot for them to turn. "Stand back from the door!" Rob yelled, hoping that he didn't deter them from working with him to get them out. He hurried from the empty room to the meth lab door. "This is the police! I'm gonna try and break it down!" The air was disappearing as smoke billowed out in a heavy cloud. Rob looked at the door, sizing it up. It looked pretty solid. Amazing considering how sleazy a hotel it was, he thought. He took a deep breath, and the smoke filled his lungs, burning like hidden flames. It sent him into a spasm of coughing. He cleared his eyes and bent over, forcing air into his lungs. The hallway wasn't quite full of smoke yet, so he could still find breathable air if he stayed low. He took in a couple of good-sized breaths. Then, before he could stop himself, he ran to the door, his shoulder lowered, to hit the door midway. He figured the lock should give, hopefully before his shoulder did. Just before he hit, he imagined he saw his wife and his son. They stood at the end of the hallway. They were dressed in black, his wife holding his son close as they both stood crying. Damn, he hoped he didn't just make her a widow. Smoke smothered him. It was everywhere, burning his lungs and pulling the moisture from his eyes. It hurt to keep them open, but burned more when he closed them. The smoke swirled around him as if he was walking in the clouds. His head became heavy and he could feel himself wobble as he walked. He thought he was going to pass out, but the sensation of a million hot needles piercing his skin all over kept him awake. And then there were the screams. They were filled with such agony. There was no way someone could make a sound like that. No way was it made by a human voice. They came from all around him, but he couldn't see through the dense smoke. He didn't just hear them, he could feel them. Their screams forced their way into his head, vibrated off of his optic nerves, and danced on his inner eardrums before finally settling at the base of his skull. They sent sparks of pain shooting to all his nerve endings. He didn't want to hold his head up anymore. He wanted to let it fall to the side and make him fall. The floor looked so comforting as it lay before him, burning and peeling away. The shrieks faded as the smoke circled around him, and the fire slipped away into nothing. The heat from the fire disappeared and was replaced with an icy chill running down his spine. Shapes began to appear in the smoke. Bodies took form around him, hidden in the darkness as the light from the room faded. The shapes moved slowly as if they waded in water. They came to him, surrounding him in a tightening circle. Just beyond them, everything was dark. The walls that once made up the room were gone. Rob looked around, watching as the forms approached. He spun around as they grew nearer. "Stay away!" He didn't know why, but he was suddenly afraid of them. He'd burst into the room to save them, but something had changed. It didn't feel like the same room anymore, and these didn't feel like the same people. Rob raised his gun and started swinging it around in different directions. The screams started again, growing even louder than before, ringing in his ears. It felt like they were trying to tear every cell in his body apart. Pain was everywhere. Every part of him just wanted to get away. He dropped his gun to grab his head. He doubled over, and it felt like his insides were being ripped out. He screamed, "Stop it! Just stop it!" The shapes reached out to him. Their hands came through the darkness, getting close enough to pull at his clothes. The screams grew louder and louder. Blood began to flow from cracks forming in his skin. He began to tear apart on the outside. Somewhere in the darkness, he could feel that something was coming for him. It was there in the darkness, behind the shapes, and patiently waiting. But waiting for him to do what? Rob still felt the chill in his spine when his eyes burst open and the screams faded back into the nightmare. His sheets were soaked with sweat, but the room still felt cold. The sweat had nothing to do with being cold. He could feel a chill on his back, and confused for a moment, he looked down and saw the open-backed gown he was wearing. A hospital gown. He was in a hospital bed, the room very dark around him. Ah, yes, his hospital room. It came back to him. He guessed that it was probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. He didn't know for sure. nor did it really matter. It was just good to be out of the nightmare, to get away from the screams that had kept him awake for the last 2 months, laying there. The screams that he heard every night, he knew who they were. He never saw their faces, but he always knew. They were the ones he tried to save, the ones on the other side of the door that he had tried to break down. They died there while he listened to their screams. Another shiver ran down his spine, as though someone walked over his grave. He adjusted himself in bed, trying to find more warmth. Damn, why were hospitals always so damned cold? And all they would give him were those thin little sheets that they called blankets. Whoever said doctors weren't all sadists was someone who'd never been to one. "Ready for the big day?" Rob looked over at the other bed occupying the room. An old man, Tom Womansky, lay there looking over at Rob. Tom looked like he was more machine than a man, as he had so many different tubes and devices hooked up to him. Rob knew that some of it was life support, but he had no clue what the other machines were doing. When Tom spoke, it sounded more like a cough talking with a heavy Chicago accent than a person. "Get back to sleep, old man," Rob said, mocking. Tom and he had been trading playful jabs since Tom had his heart attack 3 days ago. Out of all the roommates Rob had had in his long stay, Tom was by far his favorite. He was the only one who could keep up with Rob's sarcastic wit. Too many of the others were far too into their own problems to listen to Rob and his. It made it easy to talk to the old man, and they traded insults back and forth like a couple of friendly punching bags. They took each other's barbs well, but damn, it made it hard when he was such a light sleeper. Every time Rob woke up in the middle of the night, Tom was always already awake and there to talk to. It made Rob wonder just how loud his nightmares were becoming. "You get good night sleep first." Rob looked over at him. He could see that there was more that Tom wanted to say, but he went into a coughing spasm, sending the machines in a tizzy as they tried to calm his lungs. "Hello, man, spit it out!" Tom took a deep breath, finally getting in a lungful of air. The machines whizzed behind him, steadying to their rhythmic sounds. "Nightmare?" "No." Rob smiled at the old man. Tom was right, but Rob wanted to let the man think that just maybe, Rob could enjoy his last night there. That for one night Rob would be able to sleep in peace. He would be released in the morning, so it was his big day. Maybe Tom would believe it was just nerves. "Your sheet's wet. Nightmare or not. What the hell is that anyway?" "Don't make fun." Rob smiled. "I'll miss you, old man. You get better." "You too. Take care of that wife and son of yours." "That I will." That he would. They'd already bought themselves a new house, and their old one was up for sale. Once he was picked up from the hospital, it was going to be off to their new home, far away from this hateful city. It was time for a better life for his wife and son. It was time for a safer life for them. Feeling unsafe and sleepless nights were becoming a way of life for Rob. In fact, sleepless nights had become too common since he had nearly blown himself up. They left him with a lot of time alone with his thoughts. Before Tom, who would wake up with him, he'd lie awake for half the night with no one to talk to. Of course, there had been the television, old black and whites or racy movies to occupy him somewhat, but that grew old. He always knew when morning came with the morning news starting at 4, and that was never inspiring. He stopped watching the television altogether days before, and his wife made the decision to leave the city. A little girl just a couple of years younger than his son Jake had been caught in the crossfire of a gang shooting. She went to Jake's school, and it had happened less than a block away from their home. When Rob had moved there, when he had bought that house, it had been a good school in a good area. It still was, but the gangs were moving north, venturing further into the north side. Rob couldn't be sure why, but he knew it was making the streets more and more dangerous for his own family. Rob had kept the television off since the story had broken, but that didn't stop him from thinking about it. It was even worse for his wife Robin, as she'd had to see it firsthand. He could see it in her face when she visited. She didn't know that Rob had seen the story on the news, and he didn't tell her that he had. She was trying to hide her worries from him, not wanting him to get worked up over it while he lay there in a hospital bed, not able to do anything about it. When Rob finally mentioned the possibility of them moving out of the city, she agreed without hesitation. At the time, it was just a harebrained idea with no thought behind it. Sure, it was a bad time to sell the house, but for safety's sake, she also wanted out. She did some research, and within days, she found a house in a town that was looking to bring on an additional deputy. Plus, it was a small town like she'd grown up in. Rob had always lived in Chicago, but for his wife, it would be like moving back home. All he had to do was say yes. He couldn't wait to get away. So now he had a new job waiting for him, and he was itching to step into the shoes of a small-town deputy. It would give him time to separate fact from television fiction and see how small-town life really was. Tom loved to make fun of the whole situation. He loved the idea and wanted to see Rob try to handle the change from the big city to small-town life. He thought it was a real treat, a rip-roaring laugh. Rob, however, knew deep down that the old man felt it was a great idea.
"You have fun out in Mayberry. Be the next Deputy Fife."
"Yeah, well, you stay, and don't get shot here in the Windy City."
"Yeah, you don't get in no more fires either."
"I won't. I'll be staying away from burning buildings from now on. A couple months in the hospital will teach any man that lesson."
"Don't let the nightmares bother you. You did the best you can. Silence their screams and get some sleep."
"You do the same." Rob turned away from Tom and rested his head on his pillow. He didn't want to close his eyes and let the nightmares back in, but he didn't want to continue to lie there, worrying. Anything could still happen. They weren't out yet. In the morning, his wife would arrive with their son, and they would be off to their new life. "Dear Lord, let it be a better and safer one than this," Rob whispered to himself under his breath. He didn't want Tom to hear. Tom's breathing had gone back to the quiet rhythm of sleep. It never did take him long. Rob, on the other hand, was another matter. He lay there, silently, knowing it would be at least another half hour of thinking before sleep would finally overtake him. Robin woke suddenly and looked over at the clock on the nightstand. In the dark room, the digital readout was the only light. It was just past 2 a.m. She had been dreaming heavily, but had heard something that woke her. She looked around the room, trying to pinpoint the noise that pulled her out of sleep. The room was still and quiet. She held her breath and waited, feeling someone was there hiding in the shadows. She couldn't see anyone, but the hair on the back of her neck still stood up, and a chilled breeze drifted through the room. She looked at the window. It was still closed and locked tight, and she wondered where the draft had come from. The house was old, but she didn't recall it being so drafty. In fact, one of the selling points had been how airtight and insulated it had always been. A slight wind blew outside, causing a branch to brush against the window. There were people talking down on the street. 2 a.m, and the street corner hoodlums were still running their mouths. New York was supposed to be the city that never slept. People in the Windy City, they slept, but not often. It seemed no matter what time she woke up, there was some activity outside. She had been waking up in the middle of the night a lot more often since Rob had been in the hospital. However, this time was different. This time, her sheets weren't covered in sweat from some nightmare. Robin looked over her shoulder to see Jake sleeping comfortably in the bed behind her. He was adorable, sleeping without anything to worry about. In the morning, Rob would be released from the hospital, and off they would drive to their new home. Most of the more crucial belongings were already packed and loaded in the moving van parked outside in the alley. It would be blocking the alley all night, but that was one of the benefits of her husband being a cop. Other officers already knew about the van and had assured her that it wouldn't be ticketed. Robin had been so grateful that many of Rob's friends from the force came and helped her load the truck when they'd heard of the move. Since Rob had been in the hospital, his police family had all been very supportive. Most of the officers that knew Rob spent their off shifts at the hospital. Many of the wives spent their time consoling Robin and Jake and bringing flowers and get-well cards. Everyone meant well. However, the more support they offered, the more it made Robin want to get away. It was always going to be a reminder of how she nearly lost him, and if he returned to work there, she could still lose him. She didn't like pulling Jake from his school, though. They were taking him away from all of his friends. Still, he had been in 6 fights after school this year alone, most of them after his dad had been hurt. Jake had his father's temper but had yet to learn his father's control. Maybe the change of pace to a smaller town would help him calm down. There it was again, that sound. She had heard it in her sleep and wasn't sure if she'd been imagining it. It sounded like it was coming from downstairs, like something had been knocked over and then glass rattling. Robin looked over at the display on the wall. The house alarm still showed green. The house should be secure and safe, but there it was again. Something else was knocked over. This time she could hear glass breaking. She reached over to the nightstand to grab the phone off its charger, but it wasn't there. She propped herself up and looked again, confirming that the phone was missing. "Damn," she whispered to herself. It was probably down in the kitchen. She had been talking to her mother about the big move earlier and hadn't brought the phone back up with her before bed. She'd have to sneak herself into the kitchen to call 911. It was either that or chance making it to the other phone in the living room. She didn't like either option, but sitting around in her room waiting for whoever was downstairs to come upstairs, she refused to finish the thought. What did she have? She scanned the room. Everything other than the mattress they slept on and the clock was all packed and in the living room downstairs. The room was empty. She had no weapons, nothing to defend herself. She had to do it. She had to sneak down to the kitchen. It was her only option. Robin stood quietly and made her way to the door on her toes, avoiding the boards she knew would creak in the silence. She stood at the door, realizing that she had been holding her breath as she slowly opened the door, quietly released it. She looked into the hall and looked for any shadows or any sign that anyone was already upstairs or working their way up. There was nothing. The house had fallen silent. She stepped into the hallway, taking one last look at Jake before easing the door shut behind her. She locked it to make sure that he stayed safe. She couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to him. Another piece of glass broke on the floor downstairs. Robin stopped on the staircase, listening for footsteps, for anyone moving around below. Nothing. She stood there for what seemed an eternity, and then bent down to see if she could see anything in the living room at the bottom of the stairs. She couldn't see any movement. She continued gradually down the stairs and silently reached the bottom. She paused there, still listening, but the only thing she could hear was her own strained breathing. She decided to take a chance and peek into the living room. She stayed low and close to the wall, trying to remain hidden. Most of the room was packed away in boxes. Only a few knickknacks were left here and there around the room, as well as the array of photos over the fireplace. They'd run out of boxes, so Terry, one of Rob's closest friends, was supposed to bring a box for the last of it when he came by in the morning. Above the pictures was a large mirror that had been her grandmother's and had been left to her. It was a beautiful mirror with gilt framing. It had a very odd design that almost all of their house guests commented on. The mirror always became a topic of conversation at some point when they entertained, as it always looked out of place in their North Chicago home. It looked more like it belonged on some southern plantation or in a mansion. It should be hanging somewhere more fitting for something so beautiful and ornamental. Her attention lingered on the mirror, before turning to the pictures they kept below it. They had all been there and standing in place when she had gone to bed, but now 3 of them had been knocked over and 2 of them were missing. There were only 2 pictures still standing. They were all her favorite pictures of her and Rob with Jake. Rob's favorite picture still stood there, the picture they'd taken when she was 5 months pregnant with Jake. She had always begged Rob to let her throw it out, but he wouldn't stand for it. They were both so happy and excited with the baby on the way. She knew that Rob had a slight superstitious streak to him, though he would never admit to it. She believed that part of the reason that he wouldn't throw away the picture was he was afraid something would happen to Jake, as it was a picture of her when Jake was inside of her. Rob wouldn't allow her to throw away any of his pictures, for that matter. As for that particular picture itself, it was probably Rob's favorite because she was so fat and he could poke fun at her for it. Not harshly, but in that fun way that he did sometimes with his offbeat humor and his charming smile. One of the remaining two pictures shook and then tipped forward, falling to the floor as though someone had thrown it. She could hear it land and knew that the glass in the frame had shattered. Robin stepped into the living room and hurried past the rows of boxes to where the picture had just fallen from the mantel. The three pictures lay on the floor, their frames broken, the glass in pieces scattered across the hardwood. She moved carefully to avoid stepping on any of the shards in her bare feet. Robin looked around the room. She was alone. The windows were closed, so no breeze could blow through. It was dark and silent, yet she had a sudden chill run down her spine again and felt cold air on her neck. She was alone, but felt as though someone was watching her. She could feel it, a presence, and could see her own breath as she exhaled. She'd felt this once before. She knew it, but she didn't remember where. It was an odd sensation, and she couldn't help it. Someone was there, hiding in the darkness. It wasn't so much a who, but a what, and it frightened her. Something was in her house, and she couldn't see it. It was watching her. She could feel it. The last photo behind her on the mantel shook violently. She turned to look at it just in time to see it launch off the mantel and land farthest away of any of the pictures. This one had made it to the other side of the room before it smashed into the wall. The frame exploded and glass was thrown everywhere. Out of the corner of her eye, a shape moved in the mirror. She turned to look at it and then turned back to look at the rest of the room. There was nothing there. It was gone. Chapter 2. "Are you ready?" Josh said. He was nervous. He didn't like being out there, even if it was him who brought the others. "Sure," Aaron said. He was looking at the large house, trying to act tough and not let Josh know just how scared he was. The Cullens' house loomed over them like a large beast getting ready to eat its prey. Aaron didn't like standing next to it. The house was abandoned and stood in the woods on the outskirts of town. Aaron didn't know how long it had been empty, but he'd heard the stories about it his whole life. It was known as the Dark Place, and the woods, well, no one ever ventured into them after sunset. There had always been plenty of ghost stories surrounding both the house and the surrounding woods. Aaron's grandmother had especially told him to stay away. She would say that there had been a great evil there once, and that the ground had turned bad. Aaron always thought she was just being spooky and trying to scare him. Now he understood. As soon as he stepped into the woods, it had felt like the warmth of the sun had been sucked away, leaving only the chill of the shadows. He didn't like it. He had the feeling that they were being watched. The little hairs on the back of his neck stood, and his skin felt cold. It was nearly 90 degrees in the shade, and he had to fight to keep from shivering. "So you have to go through the house, up the stairs, and into the master bedroom. You can stand there," Josh was saying. Aaron hadn't been paying attention to him, but he looked up where Josh pointed. In the upper right corner of the house there was a window. Though most of the windows in the house were broken, that one looked untouched. Aaron thought that he could see someone standing there, looking at them. Someone standing back in the room so that Aaron could only see a shadow, but then the form moved, and it was gone. Aaron turned to look at Josh, who was standing there with a big grin. "So, do you think you're man enough to join the Monsters Club?" Josh asked. Aaron looked back at the house, feeling a lump of fear build in the pit of his stomach. He was working hard to hide it, and quickly looked back at Josh, forcing a smile of his own. "Sure thing. Easy." "Well, okay, tough guy. You get to that window, and I'll recommend you for the club." Aaron couldn't believe he was doing it. As he stood just inside the doorway of the large house, Josh, of course, stayed outside. He knew that chicken wouldn't be coming in with him. Aaron doubted if any other members had done this either. No, they wanted Aaron to do it because Aaron wanted in and wasn't part of their clique. He doubted that they were even fans of horror movies. They would probably all crap their pants if they watched a true horror film. The Monster Club was one that Josh had put together. They met every week at his house, in the home theater of his basement, and they watched what they called scary movies. Aaron had been watching horror films for as long as he could remember. His mother was a huge horror buff. For Aaron's 9th birthday, his mother had gotten him a large Freddy Krueger talking doll that he kept in its box in his room. Josh, on the other hand, was always talking about the new and latest horror films, the remakes that littered the video store shelves. Aaron wondered what they would ever do if they actually watched something like Aliens or The Exorcist, something that would truly scare the pants off them and give them nightmares. Josh and all his friends were jocks. He couldn't see them actually having the intelligence to enjoy a classic horror film without heckling as they watched. Still, Aaron wanted to find out for sure, and joining the club couldn't hurt. Maybe they would turn out to be decent, and if they accepted Aaron, maybe he wouldn't be looked at as the weird kid in town. And watching horror films every week was never a bad thing. Aaron wanted to hurry up the stairs and make it to the master bedroom as quickly as possible. Just get in and get out, then Josh would be forced to let him in the club, since he'd have fulfilled all the requirements they'd thrown at him. Aaron took a brief look around as he neared the stairs. The house was dim, and little sunlight filtered in through the windows. The tree limbs outside shook in the wind. Their shadows looked like giant arms reaching in from outside to grab him. The main source of light came through the living room just to the left of the front hallway. Aaron stopped with his foot on the first of the stairs to look into the room. He thought he had seen something moving out of the corner of his eye. Something had shifted in the shadows. Aaron held his breath and listened. He could almost hear the dust settling from the slight breeze that had come through the door when he walked in. It unnerved him how still and silent the house was. In the heavy air, he had a strong feeling that something wasn't right. There was evil in the house, and he was walking right into it. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe he did watch too many horror films. Aaron stepped away from the stairs and slowly crept into the living room. It was in disorder from 30 years of neglect and abuse. The windows were smashed by rocks which lay there on the floor around the room. Rocks thrown by kids throughout the years, many of them too afraid to do more. Aaron figured that most of the rocks were probably from years ago, as for most people in town the house was a distant and long-forgotten memory. The couch was torn, and what was once its insides was matted and dirty and spread throughout the room, much of it probably carried off by birds and other creatures throughout the years. Aaron did another scan of the room, a thought occurring to him. It did look like there was a lot of damage done by animals, but nothing else. No animal remains or waste, no bird nests, no bat droppings below the chimney. There was nothing other than the destruction that would ever have made Aaron believe that they'd been there. He walked to the broken window and looked outside. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't place what it was. "Wrong window, fudge knocker!" Josh yelled from where he stood a few yards away. Aaron looked at him, but then turned to look at the woods. The woods were quiet, just like the house. There was nothing moving, no animals skittering about, No insects buzzing, no birds chirping. Everything was as silent as if they were in a bubble and the rest of the world outside. Aaron backed away from the window. All he had to do was get up the stairs to the bedroom, look down at Josh, and wave. Then they could hurry up and get out of there. Just run up the stairs and be done with it. It would take less than a minute. All he had to do was run, just run. Aaron glanced quickly at the portrait that hung over the large fireplace. He guessed it was of the family that used to live there. Most of the portrait was badly damaged. The son and the wife were cut up and their faces had become shredded canvas. However, the face of the father who stood behind them wasn't touched. He stood there smiling grimly behind them, his eyes direct and stern. Aaron could see that though the man smiled, it was strained and didn't seem natural. He felt his skin grow cold, and the man seemed to look directly at him, as though somehow he had changed position to do so. Aaron crossed the room slowly, keeping his back to the picture. He couldn't shake it, the feeling that the picture itself was watching him. Those eyes looking right at him was something that, while ridiculous, chilled him to his bones. It was crazy, and he knew it, but he still couldn't shake the feeling. He nearly tripped over the stair risers when he backed into the hallway. He had to reach out quickly to keep himself from falling backward into the wall, and it was a good thing he did. The wall was crumbling away, falling in pieces and in on itself, leaving large holes. He was sure that if he reached out and put any weight against it, he would fall right through. Aaron stepped onto the first step and listened to the loud creak as he slowly eased his weight onto his foot. Looking again at the walls, he hoped that the stairs were sturdier. He didn't want to have to explain how he fell through the stairs in a house no one was allowed in, either to Renner, the local cop, or his parents. His being there wouldn't sit well with either one. Besides, who knew how far he would fall? It looked like the stairs going down to the basement ran under the stairway going up to the second floor. He could see the door behind the stairs along the hallway and guessed that must be where it went, into the darkness and whatever had been trapped down there over the years. If he were to fall through, he'd land on the basement stairs and then continue down to whatever kind of floor laid beneath. Aaron took another slow, cautious step, then another. With each step, he held his breath briefly and eased onto the tread, making sure that his foot didn't continue through the hardwood into the abyss below. The wood sagged as he stepped on it, and he could feel it struggling not to give under his weight. So what if he didn't do this challenge? So what if he didn't go up to the master bedroom and wave to Josh, showing him that he made it? Aaron could still go back home, watch horror movies in his own living room, and never have to think about it. He didn't need some stupid little monster club to enjoy movies with. He didn't need to go over to Josh's house every week just to watch a horror film in his large home theater basement. He didn't need that. But he wanted it. Besides, if he were to back out now, he'd have to face them, all of them, when school started back up in August. Sure, they had a couple of months to forget about it, but he doubted they would. They already made fun of him for how strange he looked to them, the way he always dressed in black shirts and pants. He didn't need to add anything else to the list. Aaron swallowed the lump trying to form in his throat. "You can do this," he said to himself as he took another step. He was nearly halfway up the stairs, and he could feel the steps getting sturdier. He moved more quickly, hurrying the rest of the way up the stairs until he made it to the second-floor hallway, and then paused at the top to catch his breath. His lungs burned a little. He'd been concentrating on controlling his breathing even though his heart had been pounding, like it was trying to escape his chest. He let his heartbeat ease, waited for it to slow, and then looked down the hallway to the room at the end. There it was. All he had to do was walk quickly down the hallway, rush to the window, and wave his hand. Then he could hurry back down the steps and run out the door. He would be done. It would be over, and he would never have to worry about this house ever again, never have to come near it. He could go home to his own house and play some Xbox, kill a few zombies, and forget that he had ever been there. Aaron began walking along the hallway, each creak in the floor making him step a little faster. It was almost there. He could almost feel the relief of being done and out of there. He was only a couple feet from the door, so he knew all he had to do was open it and rush to the window. The master bedroom door opened suddenly. No one was there. He was still all alone, but he watched as it suddenly opened inward. The whooshing sound it made was loud in the quiet of the house. It made him stop. Fear was working its way into him. He'd been afraid to do this, yes, but before he knew that his fears were based on nothing. It had always been all his imagination, but now it was different. Doors were opening by themselves. Aaron backed away from the door, not sure if he wanted to continue. Something opened that door. It wasn't wind. There was no breeze anywhere throughout the whole house. Even though the windows on the bottom were broken, Aaron hadn't felt any breeze his whole time in the house. Strangely, he felt the opposite. The air was thick and stuffy as though the house were locked up tight. Aaron took another step back and then thought again about what it would mean if he went downstairs. If he just walked up to Josh and told them about the door. Josh would never believe him, and then he'd have to face the ridicule. And that was exactly what he knew Josh wanted. He knew that Josh never wanted him in their club. Even if he did this, Josh would probably come up with some other test, and then another and another, until finally Aaron did fail. They were never going to let Aaron in. In fact, they would go so far as to set him up. Aaron looked back at the door at the end of the hall. The sun shone brightly into the hallway now, the light coming from the bedroom. He tried to see if there was any sign of someone in the room, anything moving. It was hard to tell, but he thought he could see feet moving under the door. It was probably Eric. Must have been him. Josh probably had his best friend Eric already there trying to spook him. Aaron now stood up straight, frustrated that they would use some weak trick in an attempt at scaring him. He wasn't going to let them get it over on him. Aaron stomped down the hallway. He wanted to make his presence known. He wanted them to know that they were not going to scare him. They'd failed, and he wasn't going to fall for some damn game they thought they could play on him. He rushed into the room, turning quickly to look behind the door, ready to yell at Eric. His arm rose to point his finger at him and let him know what he thought about their stupid game and how petty they were. He didn't scare that easy. He stopped, frozen when he realized there was no one there. The room was empty. He spun around, searching the room. It was bright. The sunlight coming in through the unfiltered windows, curtains long faded from sunlight and hanging to the side. Dust flowed and danced around the room. The bed, unmade, sat to the side of the room, and next to it, Aaron could see a large dark brown spot that looked like something had soaked into the carpeting. Aaron looked back at the door and the large dresser topped with a large makeup mirror above it. It was a beautiful dresser and mirror combo, something Aaron's mother would have loved to have. The white dresser looking only slightly aged with time and was faded in areas where the sun hit it every day. The mirror on top was ornamented with gold along its border with a fancy design that Aaron had seen before. He doubted that it was cheap. He looked to the floor beside the dresser and saw another dark spot similar to what he had seen next to the bed. He looked back and forth between the two spots, suddenly realizing what they were. He stepped away from the dresser mirror, not wanting to get any closer to the larger of the two dried bloodstains. He looked up at his reflection, scared. He was there, standing where two people had died violently. He felt a rush of nausea working its way up. He thought he was going to be sick, but he wasn't about to let himself throw up in the room. He needed to get out of there. Aaron went to the window and looked down. Josh was there, playing with a stick, smashing it against a tree. Aaron knocked on the glass below and saw Josh drop the stick quickly and looked up at the window. He looked disappointed. Good, Aaron thought as he backed away from the window. He had done it, put that bully in his place. He felt good. He was excited. He wanted to get downstairs and start rubbing it in Josh's face. He sure as hell better be in that club now. Aaron started walking back toward the door when he saw something out of the corner of his eye. He turned toward the mirror. He could have sworn he'd seen something moving in the background. Josh couldn't believe it. The little psycho had done it. Why the hell did he ever have to give in to the little twerp? Eric told him he shouldn't. Actually, Eric had been all gung-ho for it, but hadn't wanted it to be a trap where Eric would be hiding somewhere and scare Aaron. Josh had opted out of that plan. He thought bringing him to the house would be enough. He didn't think the little nerd had enough courage to make it through. It was an old house, abandoned for who knew how long. Josh didn't know too much about the house itself. He just knew that something had happened that made no one want to go there. Aaron had said some murders happened there, but Josh didn't care one way or the other. Aaron knew the stories and believed them to be true. That was enough for Josh. Josh looked up at the house. It was large, probably beautiful even, back when it was first built. Aaron stepped back to the upstairs window. He stood there looking down at Josh. "Come on, get back down here! You did it! Great job! Now let's get home!" Josh yelled up at the window. He didn't like being out there in the woods. Too quiet. Aaron stayed in the window, looking down at Josh. He had a peculiar look on his face, like he was watching him but wasn't really seeing him. Then Aaron smiled and he motioned for Josh to come. What the hell does he want? Josh thought to himself as he threw down the stick he'd been hitting the tree with and walked toward the front door of the house. The cool night air, a warm fire with fresh eggs cooking in the banjo, and a clear sky above where the stars shined brightly. What more could a hobo long on the rails ask for? It was a good day, old Coolidge, he thought to himself as he sat there looking up at the sky. It was a peaceful night, and he had worked a good, hard day, earning him $40 cash, of which he now had $34 left in his wallet. The other $6 he had spent on his fine evening meal of bacon and eggs. It had been a good day. Hell, he wished they could all always be that good. Shit, if life was always like that, though, it'd get boring, he said to himself as he stirred the eggs. Sometimes, when he was all alone, it felt good to talk to himself, even if it was just to hear a voice. It broke the silence just enough to make it bearable. The delicious smell drifted to his nose, and his stomach let out a long moan of anticipation. The smell brought back memories of being a kid, of what it was like to sit down as a family. As the eggs finished cooking, he stirred them off onto his plate and then quickly ripped open the package of bacon. The bacon started to sizzle as he carefully laid the strips into the pan, its aroma already replacing that of the eggs on his plate. The grease shot out, stinging his arms as he stirred and flipped. The larger pops, sending grease to his face, stung, but he was fine with that. He knew it meant a warm meal. He finished cooking up the bacon and worked it onto his plate. Then he sat back against a large rock and cocked his eyes to the sky. It was a beautiful night, and here he sat, somewhere in the depths of Arizona, or maybe it was New Mexico. From his point of view, a rider on the rails, they both seemed the same. The only thing missing was the music. Damn. He missed the times he used to ride with Spider John. Boy, that man could play some blues. They would sit back and enjoy a good meal, and Spider John would pick up his guitar and play for what seemed like most of the night. Next time old Coolidge hooked up with Spider, he was sure as hell going to have to ride again with him for a spell. Get those songs of his back into Coolidge's head so that Coolidge could remember them again when he was alone. There was a lot of hobo musicians out there. Sure, not as many as there were in that radio music most people listened to, but compared to how many hobos were out there sure were a lot of them that were musicians. Still, Spider was always Coolidge's favorite. Spider had a way of making the blues his own that would just sing to old Coolidge. Maybe Coolidge would get lucky this year and catch old Spider in Britt come August. Coolidge had missed getting to Britt, to the hobo convention last year, but he sure planned on making it back there again. Coolidge finished off the last of his bacon and eggs and then cleaned his plate with the thermos of water that he kept in his backpack, making sure not to use too much so he would have some to drink later. He then washed off the banjo, and after everything was dried, he secured it back in his bag. He tied it up as garbage and put that away as well, with his bag. Ah yes, the jungle. Wherever he found a place to lay his head for the night and catch a good night's sleep. Sometimes it was in a shelter, sometimes near a train yard, since he'd be searching for his next rail, but then, sometimes, like tonight, it would be out under the stars, out in the great wide open desert, where there was nothing around but railroad tracks that often lay silent. It was a true test of living free, to be anywhere, just lying there, living how he chose to. There was truly nothing out there, good or bad. Coolidge grabbed his backpack and started to fluff it up as he shuffled away from the rock. Yeah, it would have been nice if Spider was there to play a tune. Still, he had a smile on his face as he laid his head back and closed his eyes. Come morning, there should be an 8 a.m. passing by on that stretch of rail. It would have to slow down to an easily catchable speed when it rounded the bend in the track. It was his own private spot in the middle of nowhere, and every once and again, when the routes carried him through, he relished stopping off to enjoy it. To lie out and enjoy the silence and solitude, relishing being all by himself without any sign of civilization for miles. It was his private heaven. Gravel shifted nearby as something in the darkness made its presence known. Coolidge opened his eyes to look across the fire, staring into the open space of the desert. With the clear sky and with the moon and stars bright above, he could see through the vastness of the night to the cacti that lay deep into the desert. In the direction he'd heard the noise, there was nobody looking back, man or animal. Still, he pulled himself up to rest on his elbows and continued to look. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Something shifting at the edge of his vision, straight across the fire from him. He turned quickly to catch it, but it was gone, lost in the darkness. He scanned the desert, his eyes shifting back and forth, trying to find it. The hair on the back of his neck was standing straight, and a cold breeze moved across the desert. The desert gets cold at night, but this breeze was different than a desert wind. Something was carried on this wind, and the shiver it sent down Coolidge's spine shook his whole body. Something was coming for him. He could feel it. The fire's flame changed color and no longer sent off the waves of warmth that it had been earlier. It faded from bright yellow until slowly the color disappeared from it altogether, and it was a white flame flickering toward the sky. The air turned stale, and he no longer felt like he was out in the open desert, but instead trapped inside a room with the smell of mold strong around him. Coolidge stopped scanning the desert and turned to stare into the fire. Sudden pains flashed through him, making his vision just a white sheet of agony. He clenched his teeth and brought his fists to his temple, his head a burning inferno. His eyes teared up, and he could feel their coolness as they streaked down his face. Then a figure appeared. At first, Coolidge thought it was an illusion through the sheet of agony, but as the pain slowly faded, his vision returned. He could see a man sitting on the other side of the fire. The man looked at him, his eyes entirely black, his skin old and wrinkled and white across his visible veins and bones. He smiled at him, displaying stained yellow teeth and dark gums. Coolidge wasn't close enough to tell for sure, but he thought the smell of mold drifted off the old suit that hung off him. Strangely, the man looked somewhat familiar to him as he sat there, but Coolidge couldn't quite place him. It was there, just outside of his thoughts, like a word at the tip of the tongue, something he wanted to pinpoint, a memory he wanted to place, but he just couldn't grasp it. Coolidge stared into the man's eyes, not wanting to, but feeling there was nothing he could do to escape it. He tried, but somehow his desire never made it to action. Something was keeping his mind separate from his body. He had to look, and only his own death could have made him look away. "Damn, Coolidge, my friend, don't even think about that right now," he thought to himself, his eyes locked onto the dead man sitting across from him. The flames leapt high, briefly blocking Coolidge from the man, but before he could even begin to hope that the man would be gone, the flames settled back down, allowing him to again see across the fire. The man still sat there, his black eyes burning into Coolidge. Coolidge had never felt such a desire to run, to get away. He didn't know if the dead man was real or a dream, but Coolidge knew that he wanted to get to wherever his old legs would carry him, to run down the railway to the nearest stop, nearly 30-some miles down the rails, and not look back for fear of what would be following him. He didn't want to know if death would still be there, because in his mind, the man sitting across for him was death, and Coolidge knew it was coming for him. He never ran, and the man continued to stare at him. His wide grin continued to grow, keeping pace with Coolidge's fear as it did. The man moved closer, and Coolidge had the sudden thought that he was about to jump across the fire and grab him, that he would try and wrestle old Coolidge and drag him down into some depths Coolidge didn't want to think about. "Get home," the man said, his voice raspy whisper barely heard on the night wind. Coolidge never even saw his lips move. It was more like the words came from the air around him. Coolidge pulled himself away from the fire, leaning back against the large rock behind him. The man was face to face with Coolidge faster than he could see him move. 1 second, the man was on the other side of the fire. The next, he was hovering just centimeters away from Coolidge's face. Coolidge could now clearly see the black eyes of the man. There were no whites around the irises. They were pure black, and they were fixed on Coolidge's. Their stare was unblinking. "Get home." The stench of the man's breath was foul as it filled Coolidge's lungs. It smelled of rotten garbage, made worse by a faint, sweet smell of cinnamon. It turned Coolidge's stomach, and he could feel the eggs and bacon threatening to come back up. Coolidge closed his eyes and turned his face away, finally able to pull them away from the dead man. "Please, Lord, please," Coolidge said under his breath. He had barely been able to spit out the words, hardly able to breathe in the bad air. He felt a weight lifting around him, and the air started to clear. Coolidge opened his eyes to find the man was gone. He let out a long sigh of relief. His chest ached, and his head was reeling from what had just happened. He sure as hell didn't want to be a part of any more of that. Coolidge quickly packed up his stuff, making sure to leave no mess before he started making his way over to the rail. The walk would be long, but his only other option was to just sit there all night, waiting for the morning train. He could walk it. And hell, with death on his back, he figured the walk would be pretty damned quick.